My name is Tamiko Katsumoto. I am a rheumatologist at Stanford University, and I'm excited to present to you our scoping review of the impact of climate change on rheumatic disease. I want to provide some background, which is I just literally had a conversation with Markalee and said, this is a very nascent field. And she commented, yes, actually, if you looked and searched climate change in rheumatology from like a couple years ago, you would find one paper. And that paper was by my colleague, Dr. Thomas Bush, who's the lead author on this. It's really crazy how little there has been. And now if you search, you'll find two. So I just want to provide that background context just to set expectations and to let you know rheumatology is a little bit slow on the uptake, but we're getting there. So with that, I want to also really introduce and thank my co-authors, Dr. Leah Stolyar, who's from Stanford, as is Hong-Nei Wong. She is a DVM, whoever that was in the back, talking about One Health. We have a veterinary medicine doc. She was actually our librarian that helped us. And Lola Falasinu, who is also from Stanford. Also Chathu Dandania, who is from Sri Lanka, and Christina Lanata from the NIH. And Christina also works in Lima, Peru. So there's a really quite diverse group. We're very lucky. So with that, here's my disclosure slide. I wanted to start with a little bit of background context and rationale. And I think, similar to some of these other fields, I think neurology is an example where the direct and the indirect impacts of climate change on rheumatic disease are very poorly studied and difficult to study. So I think the impacts may be more indirect. They may involve multiple organ systems. They also may take longer to manifest and hence are more difficult to discern true cause and effect relationships. One thing I can tell you is there is an increasing incidence and prevalence of rheumatic disease. So for example, we're seeing an increasing burden of autoimmunity. There's a nice study by Fred Miller et al. Who've shown ANAs are increasing over time. The dreaded ANA test, there's tons more of them we're seeing now. What's contributing to that? Could there be environmental factors? Could it be COVID, multiple different insults you could imagine. I'll also mention that I'm not an infectious disease doctor, but we have to be thinking globally, and there is an increasing burden of infections that have arthritogenic manifestations that is playing into the mix of what we see in our clinics. There's rheumatology-specific considerations I'd like to highlight. One thing that we do is we immunosuppress people, and that can have consequences in the setting of a combination, co-infection, infection plus autoimmunity. I'll mention to you the other complexity is that there are certain infections that may actually predispose to autoimmunity. One that I'll mention is chikungunya, which actually can cause either short-term viral arthritis. Sometimes that evolves into a long-term RA-like illness. So again, infections interplay with autoimmunity. In fact, infections, often viral infections, will trigger lupus flares and a lot of flares of our disease. So this is a very kind of complex, nuanced field. So I was kind of stepping back to think about, how can we conceptualize what climate change is doing to our rheumatic diseases? And like I said, it's a bit abstract. So I found a nice review of the epidemiology of rheumatoid arthritis, and this kind of nicely schematizes what are the risk factors for RA as sort of our signature model disease. So we know poor oral health, chronic periodontitis can predispose to RA. There's various sex-specific sort of hormonal factors. In addition, lifestyle plays a big role. And so you can imagine the role for obesity, right? You can imagine with extreme heat, with extreme cold, sedentary lifestyle. This can certainly make things worse for rheumatic diseases. Malnutrition, poor nutrition quality that we're seeing leading to obesity or alternatively the other extreme. We talked about stress. We just heard from our amazing psych colleagues, and you better believe eco-anxiety, forced migration, all these things are contributing to stress, which can certainly cause flares of our diseases. Respiratory, we just had a really great talk by our pulmonologist, and it's known that there are respiratory insults that may actually initiate as well as perpetuate autoimmune diseases. And so, indeed, pollution is, in fact, one of the big things we'll be talking about today from fossil fuels and other sources that will very much likely amplify rheumatic disease, increasing allergens with longer growing seasons. These are also playing into what we see in our clinics. Genetics are important, but I will say epigenetics are more important. So a lot of these environmental factors are altering the expression of disease. And then finally, something near and dear to my heart is intestinal health. As we're learning about, chronic diarrhea, our terrible inflammatory Western diets, these things play into rheumatic disease. Increasing diarrheal illness is going to cause more, infections and reactive arthritis. We can talk, I just had a really nice talk, about diet and how it's such an important part of my practice, because it turns out we can also fix, we can help rheumatic disease with a better diet, more plant-based, plant-forward diet, anti-inflammatory diet, and also help planetary health in that regard. So again, so many different factors just to kind of paint the picture of what we're talking about here. So jumping into the questions, we asked the question, what is known about the relationship between rheumatic diseases and climate change, including extreme weather events, about specific pollutants, such as those from fossil fuels that will contribute to climate change, malnutrition that can be a consequence of climate change. And then secondly, we delved into the literature about what is known about how climate change may alter the geographic ranges of infectious diseases that have arthritogenic, so joint-related manifestations. And for this question, we focused not on just all, we focused on changes in the range. What can we expect to see more of in the future? So just to briefly outline our search strategies, I mentioned to you earlier, when you looked at climate change and rheumatology, you got pathetically little in terms of what came back. So we then expanded our search strategy to include, again, some of the climate-related exposures, such as tropical storms and heat waves, floods, drought, wildfires, air pollution. We actually took a deeper dive into some of the more specific pollutants mentioned here, UV light and malnutrition. We took a broad swath of rheumatic diseases. And remember, we are the ones that see a lot of these obscure, bizarre diseases, all these bizarre acronyms, that's us. But really a lot of RA, lupus, Sjogren's, scleroderma, those types of diseases. And then finally, we did focus on viral, bacterial, and fungal agents that can cause arthritogenic manifestations. I'm going to highlight dengue and chikungunya, Lyme disease, coccidioidomycosis. Some of these have been discussed, but there's a whole family of alpha viruses with, again, more obscure names that are listed here that we also looked at and didn't find much on those. So here's the quick Prisma diagram. Just to let you know, when we started our search, we focused on Embase and PubMed. We did a targeted search of Journal of Climate Change and Health, and we got 12,000 studies. It was a lot. And then with duplicates removed, we screened close to 10,000. So this sounds like there's tons of amazing research in rheumatology. It turns out when we did a deeper dive, we sought 623 studies for retrieval and eligibility. And in the end, we ended up with 255 studies to review. So in terms of those articles, 148 were on climate factors and rheumatic diseases, and I'll show you that data with more granularity. 107 were on the geographical spread of arthritogenic infections. And you can appreciate over time this really nice, again, curve. There is increasing research in these areas. So let's start with where were these studies from? No surprise, the top ranking area was North America. We saw 65 studies from North America, 64 from Asia, 51 from Europe, Latin America, 27. And then of course, as is the case in the theme here throughout, is lots less representation from the global South. We looked at where these studies were coming from for the specific diseases. So for rheumatoid arthritis, our big disease, majority of studies from North America, Asia, and Europe. For lupus, there was a lot of studies focused in Asia and North America. And then I'll mention again a few others, Kawasaki's, lots of interest from Asia, and scleroderma was mostly Europe focused. Sjogren's, I think I probably covered a lot of studies that Barb mentioned in her ophtho review, but very Asia focused. So again, just a smattering of a few papers here and there. But I think it's important to emphasize when you look at what was actually studied, really the focus was on air pollution. When we looked at a lot of these other climate-related exposures, we found, sadly, not much. So this is really a scoping review about air pollution. There was a little bit on malnutrition. I will say it was not specific to climate change, but it was just, again, what malnutrition does to our rheumatic diseases. And there were 22 studies there. And then we looked also, there were a few studies on temperature and UV light that were a little bit mixed. So in the second column, you can see this is showing the, air pollution caused increased disease activity in the majority of studies that we looked at. Temperature and UV light were actually a little bit more mixed in terms of the impact they had on rheumatic disease. And then I'm just going to point out at the very bottom, there were no studies that were, no, I should say no primary studies that looked specifically at climate change and rheumatic disease. We took a deeper dive into the specific pollutants that were associated with different rheumatic disease activity. And probably the most commonly studied one is PM 2.5 that you guys are all most familiar with. And in almost in all cases, that was associated with the worsening disease or increased rheumatic disease activity or increased incidence. And really, there was, again, fewer studies on PM10, on NO2, SO2, and carbon monoxide. Ozone was kind of an interesting pollutant because it had a little bit of a mix. There were a few studies suggesting there was decreased rheumatic disease activity related to ozone. I think that's interesting. Don't fully understand it. Something worthy of future exploration. I want to take the opportunity to call out a paper that I felt was particularly well done by our colleagues at the Brigham. And this was a paper where they looked at, they identified hospitalizations among 14,000 individuals that had rheumatic disease living in Massachusetts. And what they did was they looked at patients based on social vulnerability index, which is 15 variables that characterize how susceptible a neighborhood is to hazardous events, how readily those communities can mobilize to prevent these adverse events. And there are various different domains that they looked at to factor into that index. They also looked at the heat vulnerability index, which measures exposure to extreme heat, and then the sensitivity of those populations to, in terms of what's their likelihood to be vulnerable based on overcrowding, extremes of age, disability, et cetera. And then they looked at adaptive capacity, meaning did they have a vehicle? Did they have internet? Were they unemployed? And what was really, again, this is probably one of the best done studies that we have in our rheumatology literature. And what they found was that individuals that lived in the lowest social vulnerability index areas had 1.84 times higher odds of having 4 or greater hospitalizations. Further, they found individuals living in the highest heat vulnerability index locations had a 1.64 times greater odds of greater than 4 or more hospitalizations. So I think this is an example of the type of research we need more of in rheumatology. And I just am highlighting an example that really stood out to us. So just for fun, we did our own gray literature search of Rheumatology Association websites. And the take-home point here, the punchline is, there's pathetically little activity going on at the level of rheumatology organizations. So the ACR, our organization, there were just a couple of climate presentations at the meeting a year ago, a very little bit in terms of what's going on. Canada had one article. British Society of Rheumatology had a comprehensive sustainability plan, but lots of organizations had nothing, except for Down Under. The Australians are leading the pack here, and they have, when you search their website, they have 60 results on climate change issues, and they have developed a comprehensive position statement on climate change. So we are looking to Australia to lead the way. So switching gears to the infectious disease aspect, I mentioned to you there were a number of different infections we looked at. And on the very bottom, you can see that we found very few articles on some of these more obscure, like alpha viruses and other ones. Several of them we didn't identify any papers. I'm going to highlight dengue as really front and center. Lots of activity showing that the range of dengue is increasing substantially. Lyme is something to look out for, chikungunya, coccidioidomycosis. And really, and when I said range, so range is increased for the majority of these. Range variable means that it's increasing in some areas and decreasing in others, but really there's very few. There was one paper speaking to rickettsial Rocky Mountain spotted fever where it showed a decrease in range. And here's just a map to show you, in general, that dengue is going to be a problem. So this is something we all need to be preparing ourselves for. In endemic regions, it's going to get worse. In areas like even North America, we're going to start to see this, and Europe as well. Lyme disease is spreading, particularly in North America, in Europe, Mediterranean basin. I'll mention that cocci is really going to be a problem here in the States, so we're going to have to keep our eyes out for that, given sort of the droughts and dust issues. So we'll keep our eyes out for these emerging infectious diseases. So I think this is really the money slide, which is what are the gaps? And I think the bottom line is the gaps are many. I divided this into sort of 4 domains based on climate and health and what are the main focuses. Extreme weather, we need more studies like the one that I cited from Brigham, really speaking to what are going to be the impacts of either extreme heat or extreme cold on our rheumatic disease activities. We need to be thinking about social determinants of health, vulnerability indices like that study did. In terms of water, food, air quality, and pollution, lots of other opportunities. So for example, waterborne illness is going to cause a lot of enteric infections. It's going to cause a lot of reactive arthritis. So there's things that are going to come into our clinic in kind of a more, again, a more obscure way that we're not going to always, we have to be thinking about these things. Floods are going to cause molds. And again, I've seen so many patients who've had issues with their inflammatory disease activity flaring related to things like mold inhalation. Food insecurity is a huge issue, decreasing nutrient density. I think that these are going to lead to worsening disease activity of a lot of our rheumatic diseases. There's been little literature on wildfires, and I think that a lot of our patients also have issues with their lungs. Interstitial lung disease is not uncommon. So we need to work with our pulmonary colleagues, also our cardiovascular colleagues, kidney, nephrology. We're going to see more, we need to prepare ourselves for more severe infections, given the fact that we're concomitantly immunosuppressing a lot of these people, as well as the fact that I mentioned infections can trigger autoimmune disease flares. And then, of course, last but not least, the mental health and well-being aspect, the fact that the displacement from natural disasters, the food shortages, the increasing stress. Stress, again, is a well-known precipitant of rheumatic disease flares. So not to be too doom and gloom, but there's a lot of opportunity for further research where we do need to be thinking about these things. So in conclusion, I think we hypothesize that climate change and all of its environmental impacts may be driving an increased incidence, prevalence, and severity of rheumatic diseases. Our scoping review does reveal there's a dearth of literature speaking to the direct impacts of climate change on rheumatic disease. And the majority of literature that we did find was focused on the indirect impact, primarily pollution. It was clear there's a lot of geographic disparities, fewer publications in the global south. And then we do need to keep an eye out on our infectious diseases with arthritogenic manifestations, the greatest one being dengue, which is anticipated to spread in endemic areas, but enter new areas. Lyme is of concern, as is cocci, as is chikungunya. Limitations for our scoping review is there are obvious language bias, publication bias. We could obviously do a much more thorough gray literature search. We didn't actually physically focus on stress or vitamin D. There's just a lot of mixed results in those areas. I'll mention that overall, rheumatology remains quite ill prepared for the impacts of climate change on rheumatic disease and arthritogenic infections. I think clear that more research is needed, especially in the global south. That is, and in terms of vulnerable populations, we should focus in that area, especially given that's where the more severe impacts are expected to be seen. I want to highlight the fact that there is a global rheumatology workforce shortage. My dear colleague Chatu, who's in Sri Lanka, mentioned that obviously, I mean, she is, we think that we're backed up and wait times for room visits, at Stanford are 9 months right now. You can only imagine what it is abroad. It's really been a problem. And so we need to really have, again, try to bolster our workforce in terms of training, recruiting more rheumatologists, advanced practice providers to really help fill this gap. Because again, who's got time to do research when you're literally on the front lines trying to put out fires? So with that, I want to say thank you for your attention and really thanks for the opportunity. And we'll take questions after.